The people who laugh at your dream are often the same people who cannot recognize it until someone more important does. My father said something that night that stayed with me far longer than he ever imagined. We had gathered at my parents' house just outside Columbus, Ohio, for my mother's birthday. One of those familiar Sunday dinners that looked warm and welcoming from the outside, but always carried an invisible tension for me. The dining room smelled of roasted chicken, fresh dinner rolls, and apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter. My sister Emma had arrived with her husband and their 2 children. My father, David Carter, stood proudly near the grill talking about stock investments with my brother-in-law, while my mother, Linda, finished setting the table. Everyone seemed relaxed except me. I had learned years ago that family dinners usually ended with someone asking about my business, and somehow that question always became the evening's entertainment. At 31 years old, I owned a small company that handcrafted premium leather journals and executive notebooks for professionals, attorneys, architects, and business leaders. It was not a glamorous business, and it certainly was not a billion-dollar technology company. I rented a modest workshop, employed 6 people, and spent most of my days designing products, speaking with customers, and carefully packaging every order before it left our building. I loved what I did because every notebook we created was meant to last decades instead of months. I believed there was still room in this world for craftsmanship, patience, and quality. Unfortunately, those were values my father no longer believed had much place in modern business. As soon as everyone settled around the table, Emma smiled and looked toward me. "So, Noah, how is the little notebook shop doing?" she asked with the kind of playful tone that always sounded harmless until everyone else joined in. Before I could answer, Dad chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "Still making expensive journals by hand?" he asked. "I keep telling him that people carry laptops now." Several people laughed politely. I smiled because arguing had never changed. Anyone's opinion. "Business is steady," I answered. "We have been growing." Dad shook his head with a grin. "Growing," he repeated. "Son, steady is what people say when they do not want to admit they are barely surviving." More laughter followed. My mother tried to change the subject by asking Emma about the children's soccer season, but Dad was not finished. "You know," he continued, pointing his fork toward me, "when Noah was younger, I thought he would eventually find something bigger. Instead, he decided to build a career selling fancy notebooks. If you ask me, that is more of a hobby than a business." I noticed my nephew looking at me with genuine curiosity, as though he was trying to decide whether his grandfather was joking. I simply took another bite of dinner before answering. "I enjoy what I do." Dad smiled. "Of course you do. But enjoying something does not always mean it is successful." That sentence landed harder than I expected because it sounded almost identical to something he had told me years earlier when I first rented my tiny workshop. Back then he had insisted I would give up within 6 months. 6 years had passed since that conversation. My company was still standing, still growing, and supporting 6 families besides my own, yet somehow none of that counted because it did not fit his definition of success. Emma looked at me sympathetically. "Have you ever thought about selling the business and getting a corporate job?" she asked. "With your work ethic, you could probably do well." "I have thought about it," I replied honestly. "I just realized I would rather build something that belongs to me." Dad laughed again, this time louder than before. "Belongs to you," he said. "What belongs to you is a workshop that probably costs more to heat than it earns." Even my brother-in-law smiled awkwardly before looking down at his plate. Nobody intended to be cruel. That almost made it harder. They genuinely believed they were helping me see reality. The truth was that none of them had ever asked how many customers we served, how many repeat orders we received, or why some of the largest law firms in Ohio quietly purchased our products every year. They never asked because they had already decided the answer. Small business meant small success. Handmade meant outdated. Quiet growth meant failure. After dessert, everyone moved into the living room while I volunteered to help my mother clean the kitchen. As we rinsed dishes together, she gently touched my arm. "Your father worries about you," she said softly. "He just wants you to have security." I smiled. "I know." She looked at me with concern. "Does it bother you when he says those things?" I dried another plate before answering. "It used to." She sighed, but did not know what else to say. Neither of us wanted to argue about him on her birthday. Before leaving, Dad walked me to the driveway as he always did. The evening air felt cool, and the neighborhood had become quiet except for the distant sound of sprinklers watering freshly cut lawns. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Son, I hope you know I only tease you because I want more for you. I looked at him calmly. Maybe I already have more than you think. He smiled patiently, the way someone smiles at a child who does not yet understand how the world works. One day you will realize that dreams do not pay the bills. I nodded respectfully. Have a good night, Dad. During the drive back to my apartment, his words echoed through my mind, but they no longer hurt the way they once had. Over the years, I had learned that people often judge a business by its size instead of its purpose. They measured success by headlines, luxury cars, and impressive office buildings. I measured it by returning customers, handwritten thank you notes, and employees who could provide for their families. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they were. Either way, I had stopped building my future around someone else's expectations. When I arrived home, I made myself a cup of coffee even though it was already late, opened my laptop to review orders scheduled for shipment the following morning, and noticed a new email sitting alone at the top of my inbox. The sender was unfamiliar. The subject line read, "Request for a private meeting on behalf of Mr. Charles Bennett." I stared at the screen for several seconds, convinced someone had sent the message to the wrong Noah Carter. The next morning, I opened the email 3 more times before I finally believed it was real. The message was short, professional, and signed by an executive assistant representing Charles Bennett, a billionaire entrepreneur whose name appeared regularly in business magazines and financial news. According to the email, Mr. Bennett had recently become aware of my company and wanted to arrange a private meeting at my convenience. There was no mention of an investment, no explanation for the request, and no attachment describing the purpose of the conversation. At the bottom of the message was a direct phone number and a simple sentence that read, "Mr. Bennett appreciates businesses that value craftsmanship, long-term thinking, and customer trust." I leaned back in my chair and stared at the workshop around me. The building was nothing extraordinary. The walls carried years of careful work instead of expensive decorations. Shelves held neatly stacked leather hides waiting to become journals. Work tables displayed cutting tools, brass rulers, thread, and unfinished notebooks that would soon be shipped across the country. Every corner reflected years of patient effort rather than sudden success. It seemed impossible that someone whose companies employed thousands of people would even know this place existed. Before responding, I searched the sender's information online. Everything matched. The email address belonged to Bennett Capital Holdings. The phone number connected to the company's headquarters in Chicago. Even so, I convinced myself there had to be some mistake. I dialed the number expecting someone to apologize for contacting the wrong Noah Carter. Instead, a pleasant voice answered immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. We were hoping to hear from you." I introduced myself and carefully explained that I wanted to confirm the message had been sent to the correct person. The assistant laughed softly. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Mr. Bennett specifically requested you. He has followed your company for quite some time and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you personally." My surprise only deepened. "May I ask what this meeting is about?" There was a brief pause before she answered. "Mr. Bennett prefers to discuss that with you directly. We agreed on a meeting the following week in Chicago, and after hanging up, I remained motionless for several seconds. I had spent years believing that the only people paying attention to my company were the loyal customers who returned every few months to order another journal. Now I was preparing to meet one of the most respected business leaders in the country without understanding why. The rest of the morning unfolded as usual. My employees arrived one by one, greeting each other with the familiar warmth that had slowly become part of our culture. Sarah reviewed customer orders, while Michael inspected the latest shipment of premium leather. Olivia carefully packaged custom journals for a law firm in Boston, making sure every detail matched the client's specifications. Nobody hurried through their work because quality had always mattered more than speed. I considered telling them about the email several times, but decided against it. Until I understood what was happening, I did not want to create excitement over something that might ultimately mean very little. Around noon, I reviewed the week's sales reports. They were encouraging, but not extraordinary. Revenue had increased steadily over the previous 3 years, and nearly 70% of our business came from repeat customers. We had never purchased expensive advertising because nearly every new client arrived through recommendations. Attorneys referred other attorneys. Architects introduced us to colleagues. Financial advisors ordered gifts for clients who appreciated products built to last. It was slow growth, but it was honest growth. That afternoon, an older customer named Harold stopped by the workshop to pick up a personalized journal. He had been buying from us for almost 5 years. As I handed him the finished notebook, he smiled and ran his fingers across the leather cover. "This is why I keep coming back," he said. "There are faster companies and cheaper companies, but there are not many companies that still care." His words stayed with me long after he left. They reminded me why I had never chased shortcuts simply to impress people who measured success only by size. Late that evening, I called my mother to wish her a good week. We talked about ordinary things for several minutes before she asked whether business had been busy. I told her it had, then mentioned I would be traveling to Chicago for a meeting. "With a customer?" she asked. "Not exactly," I answered. "Someone reached out and wanted to talk." She sounded pleased, but did not ask many questions. Before ending the call, she reminded me to drive safely and promised to save leftovers from the next family dinner. I never mentioned Charles Bennett by name. I knew exactly what would happen if my father heard the story before I had any answers. He would assume I was exaggerating or chasing another unrealistic opportunity. I preferred silence over another unnecessary debate. Over the next several days, I prepared for the trip while continuing business as usual. Every morning, I unlocked the workshop before sunrise, reviewed production schedules, answered customer emails, and helped my team complete orders. Nothing about our routine changed, yet I found myself wondering who had introduced our company to Charles Bennett. We had never entered national business competitions or appeared on television. We rarely even attended trade shows. Our reputation had spread quietly, one satisfied customer at a time. On Friday afternoon, just before closing, Sarah walked into my office carrying a stack of completed invoices. "You look distracted this week," she said with a smile. "Everything all right?" I nodded. "I have an important meeting next week." "Should I be excited?" she asked. I smiled back. "I honestly do not know yet." She laughed. "Well, whatever happens, I hope they recognize what you have built here." After everyone went home, I walked slowly through the empty workshop, turning off lights one section at a time. The quiet building reminded me how far we had come from the tiny rented garage where I had started alone with one workbench and a handful of tools. My father still saw a small business that would never become anything significant. I saw years of steady progress that could not be measured by headlines. Before locking the front door, I checked my phone one last time. A new message from Bennett Capital had arrived. It simply confirmed the meeting location and added one unexpected sentence. "Mr. Bennett has personally reserved the entire afternoon because he believes your story deserves more than a brief conversation." I left Columbus before sunrise on Tuesday morning, giving myself plenty of time for the drive to Chicago. The interstate was quiet, and the miles passed beneath my tires while the sky slowly turned from deep blue to pale gold. Normally, I enjoyed long drives because they gave me time to think, but that morning my mind kept returning to the same question. Why would someone like Charles Bennett want to spend an entire afternoon talking with the owner of a workshop that most people had never even heard of? I had prepared for the meeting as carefully as I could. A portfolio containing financial statements rested on the passenger seat beside me, along with samples of our journals and a notebook filled with ideas about future growth. Even so, I reminded myself not to expect anything extraordinary. Perhaps he simply appreciated handmade products. Perhaps one of his assistants had recommended us. Whatever the reason, I decided I would treat the meeting like every other opportunity in my life, with honesty rather than performance. Shortly after noon, I arrived in downtown Chicago. The headquarters of Bennett Capital stood above the surrounding buildings, its glass exterior reflecting the afternoon sunlight. The lobby was elegant without feeling excessive. Warm wood, natural stone, and carefully chosen artwork created an atmosphere that felt more welcoming than intimidating. A receptionist greeted me by name before I even introduced myself. "Mr. Carter, welcome. Mr. Bennett is expecting you." She handed me a visitor badge and invited me to take the private elevator to the executive floor. As the elevator climbed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal doors. I wore the same navy suit I reserved for important client meetings. It was several years old, but well-maintained. I had never believed expensive clothing made someone more trustworthy. When the elevator doors opened, an assistant welcomed me with a warm smile and escorted me through a quiet hallway lined with photographs of manufacturing plants, family-owned businesses, and community projects rather than pictures of luxury offices or financial awards. That detail surprised me. It suggested priorities different from what I expected. We stopped outside a large conference room overlooking the city. "Mr. Bennett will join you in just a moment," she said before quietly closing the door behind me. I walked toward the windows and admired the skyline while waiting. A few moments later, the door opened. Charles Bennett entered alone, carrying nothing except a simple leather notebook. He was older than I expected, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a charcoal suit without a tie. His handshake was firm but relaxed. "Mr. Carter," he said with an easy smile. "Thank you for making the trip." "Thank you for inviting me," I replied. He motioned toward a small round table instead of the long conference table dominating the room. "Let us have a conversation instead of a meeting." That sentence immediately eased my nervousness. After coffee was served, he surprised me with his first question. "Why did you decide to build journals when everyone else was trying to build software?" I smiled because nobody had ever asked me that so directly. "Because software changes every few years," I answered. "People still write down their best ideas, most important decisions, and personal reflections. I wanted to create something worthy of holding those moments." He nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing. Instead, he opened his notebook and made a brief note. His next question came just as unexpectedly. "How many customer complaints did you receive last year?" I knew the answer immediately. 7. He looked up with mild curiosity. "Out of how many orders?" "Just over 28,000. "And what happened with those 7? "We replaced every product immediately, apologized personally, and asked what we could improve." Again, he quietly wrote something down. The conversation continued that way for nearly an hour. He never asked how much money I earned. He never asked about profit margins, investors, or expansion plans. Instead, he asked why customers trusted us, how we selected employees, what qualities I valued most when hiring, and what I believed would still matter 20 years from now. It felt less like a business interview and more like a discussion between two people trying to understand how values shape companies over time. Finally, I could not resist asking the question that had been on my mind since receiving his email. "May I ask how you discovered my company?" Charles Bennett leaned back in his chair and smiled. "About 4 years ago, I received one of your journals as a gift from an attorney I respect greatly. He told me it was made by a small company in Ohio that refused to sacrifice quality simply to grow faster." He gently placed his hand on the notebook he had brought into the room. "This is your work." I recognized the leather immediately. It had been crafted in our workshop years earlier. The edges had softened with use, but the stitching remained perfect. "I have carried it almost every day since then," he continued. "After that, I became curious. I asked my team to quietly observe your business." My surprise must have shown on my face because he laughed softly. "Do not worry. Nothing improper. We simply wanted to understand whether the product reflected the company or whether it was only clever marketing." "And what did you find?" I asked. He looked directly at me before answering. "We found consistency. We found employees who stayed because they respected their employer. We found customers who returned year after year without expensive advertising. We found a company that grew slowly because it refused to compromise its standards." His words were encouraging, but I still did not understand why I was sitting there. "That is kind of you to say," I replied, "but I still do not know why you wanted to meet me." He closed his notebook and folded his hands together. "Because businesses like yours are becoming rare. Everyone talks about scaling quickly. Almost nobody talks about building trust slowly." He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city before continuing. "Next month, I will host an annual gathering attended by business leaders from across the country. Every year, I introduce one company that represents principles our economy should never lose." He turned back toward me with a calm expression. "I have not made my final decision yet, Mr. Carter, but before I do, there is one more thing I would like to see." I waited quietly. "I would like to visit your workshop without announcing who I am. I want to see whether the business I have heard about is the same business that exists when nobody important is watching." The drive back to Ohio felt much shorter than the trip to Chicago, not because the highway had changed, but because my thoughts never stopped moving. Charles Bennett had not offered me a partnership, an investment, or even a promise. Instead, he had asked for something much more meaningful. He wanted to see whether my company remained the same when nobody knew they were being observed. I appreciated that more than I could explain because it reflected the very philosophy I had tried to build from the beginning. Character was never revealed during important moments. Character revealed itself during ordinary days when nobody expected recognition. By the time I unlocked the workshop early the next morning, I had already decided I would not tell anyone about Mr. Bennett's possible visit. Not my employees, not my family, and certainly not my father. If Charles truly wanted to experience our company as an ordinary customer would, then that was exactly what he deserved to see. The rest would take care of itself. Business continued exactly as it always had. Sarah greeted every customer with the same warm smile she had offered since her first day. Michael carefully rejected an entire shipment of leather because several hides showed imperfections that most people would never notice. Olivia spent nearly 20 minutes helping an elderly customer choose the right journal for his granddaughter's college graduation because she believed the gift should feel personal rather than expensive. Watching my team work reminded me that our greatest strength had never been our products alone. It was the quiet pride everyone took in doing small things well. 3 days later, my parents invited the family over for another Sunday dinner. I considered declining because I had several large orders to finish, but my mother insisted she had made my favorite pot roast. When I arrived, nothing seemed different. My father was watching a baseball game in the living room while Emma helped my mother prepare dinner. As soon as I walked through the door, Dad looked up and smiled. "How was your little business trip?" he asked. "Productive," I answered honestly. "That sounds promising," he replied with a grin. "Did someone finally convince you to find a real office job?" Emma laughed quietly while my mother gave him the familiar look that meant she wished he would stop. I simply smiled and carried the drinks into the dining room. During dinner, the conversation turned toward careers again after my brother-in-law mentioned a promotion at his engineering firm. Dad proudly congratulated him before glancing toward me. "That is what steady progress looks like," he said. "Every year, you move a little higher." He paused before adding, "Running a tiny shop is fine for a while, but eventually people have to think bigger." I took a sip of iced tea before answering calmly. "Sometimes bigger is not always better." Dad shook his head with a patient smile. "That sounds like something people say when they cannot become bigger." The table fell quiet for a moment. Years earlier, I would have defended myself. I would have explained our revenue, our customer retention, or our growth. Now I simply asked my mother to pass the green beans. The subject changed naturally, leaving my father slightly disappointed that he had failed to start another debate. Later that evening, while everyone talked in the backyard, my mother quietly joined me on the porch. "You have changed," she said softly. "Your father cannot seem to upset you anymore." I looked across the yard where he was laughing with Emma's children. "I realized something a long time ago," I replied. "People can only make you feel small if you keep asking them to measure your worth." She smiled sadly because I think she understood exactly what I meant. The following week brought one of our busiest production schedules of the year. A financial consulting firm in New York had ordered hundreds of custom executive journals for an annual leadership conference, and every member of our team focused on completing the project ahead of schedule without sacrificing quality. On Wednesday morning, just after 10 o'clock, the front door opened, and an older gentleman walked inside wearing jeans, a navy jacket, and a simple baseball cap. Nothing about his appearance suggested extraordinary wealth or influence. He greeted Sarah politely and explained that he was looking for a notebook as a retirement gift for a longtime friend. Sarah welcomed him exactly as she welcomed every customer. She asked thoughtful questions, showed him several options, and never once attempted to sell him the most expensive product. While she helped him compare different leather finishes, I remained in the workshop finishing a custom embossing order. Nearly 30 minutes passed before Sarah walked into my office. "Noah," she said, "one of our customers has a few questions about how we make the journals. Would you mind speaking with him?" I wiped my hands on a clean cloth and followed her into the showroom. The gentleman smiled warmly as soon as he saw me. "Mr. Carter," he said, "thank you for taking a few minutes." His voice sounded familiar, although I could not immediately place it. We spent nearly 40 minutes discussing leather quality, stitching techniques, paper weight, and why I believe products carried emotional value when they were built to last. He listened far more than he spoke, occasionally asking detailed questions that suggested a surprising understanding of manufacturing. Before leaving, he purchased a single journal without asking for any discount or special treatment. As he reached the front door, he turned back toward me with a gentle smile. It is refreshing to find a business where the owner speaks about customers before speaking about profits. I thanked him for visiting and wished him a safe drive home. Only after his car disappeared around the corner did Sarah look at me with a puzzled expression. That customer seemed strangely interested in how we run the company, she said. I smiled. Some people simply enjoy learning. 2 days later, an envelope arrived by overnight delivery. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored stationery. The message contained only one sentence in elegant handwriting. Thank you for showing me exactly what I hoped to find, and exactly what nobody can pretend to be for very long. Charles Bennett. For several days after receiving Charles Bennett's handwritten note, life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Orders continued arriving from across the country. The workshop remained busy from early morning until late afternoon, and our customers never realized anything unusual had happened behind the scenes. I almost convinced myself that the visit had simply been a memorable conversation that would eventually fade into another interesting chapter of my business journey. Then, on Monday morning, another email arrived from Bennett Capital. This one was longer than the first two. It formally invited me to attend the Bennett Leadership Forum in Chicago the following month. The event would bring together chief executive officers, entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders from across the United States. At the bottom of the invitation was a handwritten note that had been scanned into the message. Please come as my personal guest. There will be someone I would like you to meet. I read the final sentence several times. It still did not explain why I had been invited, but something about the wording suggested there was a larger purpose behind the gathering. I accepted the invitation later that afternoon and returned to work without mentioning it to anyone. Over the next few weeks, our company experienced one of its strongest months since opening. The financial consulting firm that had recently received our executive journals recommended us to 2 additional organizations. A regional bank placed its largest custom order in our history. Several new corporate clients contacted us after hearing positive comments from existing customers. None of these opportunities appeared because of advertising or publicity. They arrived because people trusted us enough to recommend us to others. Watching that steady momentum reminded me once again that real growth often happened quietly before anyone outside the business noticed. My father, however, noticed none of it. The following Sunday, our family gathered once again at my parents' house. Before dinner even began, he asked the same familiar question. So, Noah, how is the notebook empire? His smile made it clear he intended the question as another joke. I answered with the same calm voice I had learned to use over the years. Business has been keeping us busy. Busy is good, he replied. Profitable is better. Emma laughed gently before adding, maybe one day Noah will surprise all of us. Dad smiled and shook his head. If he surprises me, I will gladly admit it. I looked at him for a moment before changing the subject. There was no point trying to win an argument that existed only in someone else's imagination. Later that evening, while everyone gathered in the living room, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Bennett Capital confirming hotel reservations for the upcoming forum. Before I could place my phone back into my pocket, my father noticed the notification. Traveling again, he asked. Yes, I answered. Just for a business event in Chicago. Another trade show? He asked casually. Something like that. He nodded with polite indifference before turning back toward the television. Nobody asked another question, and I was perfectly comfortable leaving it that way. As the conference approached, I focused on preparing my team for several days without me. Sarah would oversee customer communication. Michael would supervise production. Olivia would manage quality inspections before every shipment left the building. They had earned my trust over many years, and I never believed leadership meant controlling every decision personally. The strongest businesses continued operating well even when the owner stepped away. The evening before my departure, Charles Bennett called me directly for the first time. His voice sounded exactly as calm as it had during our meeting in Chicago. Mr. Carter, he said warmly, I hope you are looking forward to the forum. Very much, I replied, although I still have no idea why you invited me. He laughed quietly. Sometimes expectations prevent people from seeing opportunities clearly. I would rather you arrive without either. Should I prepare anything? I asked. Only yourself, he answered. Everything else has already been arranged. Before ending the call, he added one final sentence that remained with me long afterward. The people attending this event have built remarkable companies. but I believe they still have something important to learn from someone whose name they have never heard. The next morning, I drove to Chicago once again, this time feeling less nervous and more curious. The hotel hosting the forum overlooked the Chicago River, and the lobby buzzed with conversations among executives wearing conference badges from companies I recognized immediately. As I checked into my room, I could not help noticing the impressive list of speakers displayed on digital screens throughout the building. Leaders from major manufacturing firms, technology companies, financial institutions, and nonprofit organizations would all take the stage over the next 2 days. My own name appeared nowhere in the program, exactly as I expected. That evening, a welcome reception filled the ballroom with hundreds of guests exchanging business cards and discussing markets, investments, and expansion strategies. I spent much of the evening listening rather than speaking. Whenever someone asked about my company, I simply explained that I owned a small workshop in Ohio specializing in handcrafted executive journals. Most people smiled politely before moving on to conversations they probably considered more important. I did not take offense. Years of running a small business had taught me that first impressions often reflected assumptions rather than understanding. Just before the reception ended, Charles Bennett approached me with his familiar relaxed smile. "I am glad you made it," he said. We spoke for several minutes before he glanced toward the large ballroom entrance where staff members were making final preparations for the following morning. "Tomorrow will be an interesting day," he said. "Please arrive 15 minutes early." "I would. Like you seated near the front." I nodded, assuming he simply wanted me close enough for an introduction to someone influential. As we shook hands, he looked at me with the same thoughtful expression I had seen during our first meeting. "There is one favor I would ask," he said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, respond exactly as you always have. Stay humble. Stay honest. Do not try to become the person you think everyone expects to see." I smiled. "That should not be difficult." He smiled back. "That is precisely why I invited you." The following morning, I arrived at the ballroom nearly 20 minutes before the first session was scheduled to begin. Staff members moved quietly between rows of neatly arranged tables, checking microphones, adjusting lighting, and placing name cards in their assigned seats. The room was elegant without feeling extravagant. Large windows overlooked the Chicago River, allowing sunlight to fill the space naturally. A massive digital screen stretched across the front of the stage, displaying the words Bennett Leadership Forum above the day's schedule. I found the reserved seat bearing my name near the front, exactly where Charles Bennett had requested. Around me, executives greeted one another with the confidence that comes from years of leading large organizations. Many recognized familiar faces, exchanged stories about recent acquisitions, and discussed market trends over fresh coffee. I listened respectfully, without feeling out of place. My company might have been much smaller than theirs, but I had learned long ago that every honest business faced the same responsibility. Every customer placed trust in someone, and every business either honored that trust or slowly lost it. A few minutes before the program began, Charles Bennett walked onto the stage to warm applause. He thanked everyone for traveling from across the country and spoke about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of creating companies that improved people's lives rather than simply increasing quarterly numbers. His opening remarks were thoughtful and unhurried. Unlike many speakers who relied on dramatic language, he spoke with quiet confidence, allowing each idea enough space to settle. After introducing the morning's first panel of executives, he stepped away from the podium while several business leaders discussed innovation, technology, and economic challenges. The audience listened attentively, occasionally applauding strong observations, but I noticed that Charles continued reviewing a small notebook while sitting quietly in the front row. Every so often he glanced toward me with a calm expression that revealed nothing. During the lunch break, he approached my table carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How are you enjoying the discussions?" he asked. "They have been interesting," I replied honestly, "although I have noticed something." He smiled. "What is that?" "Everyone talks about growing faster. Almost nobody talks about earning trust more slowly." He nodded with obvious satisfaction. "That observation is exactly why I wanted you here." Before I could ask another question, an event coordinator approached to remind him about the afternoon schedule. Charles turned back toward me. "Please remain after lunch. The final session is the one I hope you will remember." The ballroom filled again shortly before 1 o'clock. This time the atmosphere felt slightly different. The lights dimmed, Soft instrumental music faded, and the enormous digital screen displayed photographs of family businesses, workshops, manufacturers, farms, and community organizations from across America. Charles Bennett returned to the stage alone. Every year, he began, this forum recognizes remarkable achievements in business. Many people assume remarkable means the largest company, the highest valuation, or the fastest growth. I disagree. The room became noticeably quieter. Some businesses become extraordinary because they protect values that are becoming increasingly rare. They choose patience over shortcuts, reputation over publicity, long-term trust over immediate applause. He paused for a moment before continuing. For the past several years, my team and I have quietly studied hundreds of companies across the United States. We visited factories, offices, family businesses, retail stores, and workshops. We looked beyond financial reports. Because numbers alone never tell the entire story. Images of different businesses continued appearing on the large screen behind him. Eventually, he said, our search brought us to a modest workshop in Ohio where 6 dedicated employees build handcrafted journals one customer at a time. I felt my heartbeat quicken, although I still assumed he was simply sharing an example from his research. What impressed me was not the product, Charles continued. Many companies produce beautiful products. What impressed me was the consistency. Every customer received the same respect. Every employee took pride in every detail. Every decision reflected principles that cannot be purchased or copied. The audience remained completely silent. Charles slowly turned toward my section of the ballroom. The owner of that company accepted my visit without knowing who I was. He answered every question honestly. He spoke more about his customers than himself. And when I left, I realized I had found exactly the kind of leader our business community needs to celebrate. I suddenly understood why he had asked me to sit near the front. Before I could fully process the moment, the massive screen behind him changed. Instead of photographs, one simple name appeared in large white letters across the entire display. Noah Carter. A gentle wave of applause began somewhere near the center of the ballroom before spreading rapidly through the audience. Charles smiled warmly and extended his hand toward me. Mr. Carter, he said, would you please join me on stage? For a brief moment I remained seated, genuinely believing there had been some misunderstanding. Then the people around me began smiling and gesturing toward the stage. I stood slowly and walked forward as hundreds of business leaders applauded with sincere respect. Charles greeted me with a handshake before turning back to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, this is the founder of Carter Leather Works, a company that has never measured success by becoming the loudest voice in the room. Instead, it became one of the most trusted. The applause grew even stronger. I looked across the audience and saw people who only hours earlier had politely overlooked my small business, now watching with genuine curiosity. Charles waited for the room to become quiet again before continuing. Tomorrow, many of you will return to organizations worth millions or even billions of dollars. I hope you remember that trust is built the same way whether your company employs 6 people or 60,000. Size creates influence. Character creates legacy. He then turned toward me once more. Noah, if you would be willing, I would like you to spend a few minutes sharing how you build a company where integrity became the business model rather than the marketing strategy. As I stepped toward the podium, I realized this moment was never about proving my father wrong or impressing strangers. It was about demonstrating that quiet dedication, practiced consistently over many years, could eventually speak louder than any argument ever could. For a few seconds, I simply stood behind the podium, looking across a room filled with people whose companies were larger than I had ever imagined building. The applause slowly faded, and every face turned toward me with quiet expectation. I took a slow breath before speaking. Thank you, Mr. Bennett, I said. I wish I could tell you that I came here with a brilliant strategy that guaranteed success. The truth is much less exciting. I simply tried to build the kind of company I would want to buy from if I were the customer. A few people smiled, and the atmosphere immediately became more relaxed. When I started my business, I could not compete with the largest manufacturers on price. I could not compete on advertising because I did not have the budget. I could not promise overnight shipping or endless product lines. The only thing I could control was how every customer felt after doing business with us. The audience listened carefully. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered to the person beside them. I continued speaking exactly the way I spoke with customers in my workshop. Every notebook that leaves our building carries our name. If someone opens it 5 years later and smiles because it still feels new, then we made the right decision. If someone recommends us to a friend because they trusted us, then we grew in the right direction. That has always mattered more to me than growing quickly. Charles Bennett stood quietly near the side of the stage, listening with the same thoughtful expression he had worn throughout our conversations. I realized he had never wanted a polished motivational speech. He simply wanted honesty. After several more minutes, I thanked the audience and stepped away from the podium. The applause that followed felt different from the applause when I had first walked onto the stage. This time people were not applauding because Charles Bennett had introduced me. They were responding to ideas they genuinely respected. As soon as the session ended, dozens of attendees approached to introduce themselves. Some represented manufacturing companies. Others owned regional businesses or nonprofit organizations. Surprisingly, very few asked about revenue or profits. Instead, they asked about employee retention, customer loyalty, and company culture. One woman who led a large healthcare organization smiled and said, "Your business reminded me that growth and integrity do not have to compete with each other." Another executive admitted that hearing my story made him reconsider several decisions his company had recently made in pursuit of faster expansion. Throughout the afternoon, I answered every question as openly as I could. Whenever someone complimented me, I reminded them that none of it happened alone. I spoke about Sarah greeting customers with genuine warmth, Michael refusing to accept materials that failed our standards, Olivia treating every order as though she were preparing a gift for someone in her own family. A company, I explained, became trustworthy because ordinary people made good decisions every single day, not because one owner gave inspiring speeches. Before the evening reception began, Charles Bennett invited me into a smaller conference room overlooking the river. He poured 2 cups of coffee and smiled. "You handled today exactly the way I hoped you would." I laughed quietly. I was certain I would say something foolish. He shook his head. "No, you spoke from experience instead of ego. That is becoming increasingly uncommon." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment before I finally asked the question that had stayed with me since our first meeting. "Why me? There must be thousands of businesses like mine." Charles looked out the window before answering. "There are thousands of businesses. There are far fewer leaders who remain the same whether anyone is watching or not." He paused thoughtfully. "When I visited your workshop, nobody knew I was coming. Your employees treated me with patience. You answered every question without trying to impress me. Nobody rushed to clean the building. Nobody suddenly behaved differently because an important visitor had arrived. That consistency cannot be manufactured. It is earned over many years." His words meant more to me than any financial investment could have. Before I left, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a formal invitation to return the following year as one of the forum's featured speakers. "I hope this becomes the beginning of a long friendship," he said. "I believe people need examples that remind them success and character can still grow together." The following morning I drove back to Ohio, feeling grateful rather than triumphant. I had no desire to announce what had happened on social media or send photographs to everyone I knew. In fact, when I unlocked the workshop on Monday morning, I returned to work exactly as I always had. Sarah asked how the conference went. I smiled and answered honestly, "Better than I expected." She laughed. "Did you make any useful connections?" "I believe I made a few meaningful ones," I replied. Michael handed me a production schedule while Olivia asked me to review a custom embossing request from a longtime client. Within minutes, I was back at my workbench measuring leather, checking stitching, and discussing shipping deadlines. It felt surprisingly comforting. Nothing inside the workshop had changed, yet I quietly realized something inside me had. For years, I had wondered whether I needed to become something larger to earn respect. Charles Bennett had shown me the opposite. The values we practiced every day had already created something far more valuable than recognition. Recognition had simply arrived later. Late that afternoon, just before closing, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed my father's name. He rarely called during business hours, so I answered immediately. "Hello, Dad." His voice sounded unusually calm. "Hi, Noah. Your mother and I were wondering if you might have dinner with us tomorrow evening. There is something I would like to talk about." For the first time in many years, I noticed there was no teasing in his voice, no quiet joke waiting beneath the conversation. There was only a sincerity I had almost forgotten existed. The following evening, I drove to my parents' house with no expectations beyond having an honest conversation. The familiar neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, sprinklers watered freshly cut lawns, and neighbors waved as they walked their dogs through the quiet streets. It reminded me that life rarely announced its biggest changes with dramatic moments. More often, change arrived quietly, one conversation at a time. My mother opened the front door before I even reached it. She smiled warmly and hugged me a little longer than usual. "I am glad you came," she said softly. The dining room table was already set, but unlike our usual family dinners, only the three of us were there. Emma and her family had made other plans, leaving the evening unusually peaceful. My father walked into the room, carrying a pitcher of iced tea. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other. Then he smiled in a way I had not seen for years. It was smaller than his usual confident grin, almost uncertain. During dinner, we talked about ordinary things. My mother's flower garden had finally begun blooming after weeks of rain. A neighbor had recently retired after 40 years with the same company. The local high school football team was preparing for another season. It almost felt as though my father was searching for the right words, but did not quite know how to begin. Finally, after my mother cleared the dinner plates and brought coffee to the table, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "I saw something online yesterday," he said quietly. I knew immediately what he meant. Someone attending the Bennett Leadership Forum had posted photographs from the event, including one of Charles Bennett shaking my hand on stage. Several business publications had shared short articles about the forum as well. I had not posted any of it myself, but news traveled quickly. "Charles Bennett spoke very highly of you," my father continued. I nodded. He was very generous. My father remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. "I spent years believing that if your company ever became successful, it would happen because you changed your approach." He slowly shook his head. "Instead, it happened because you refused to change it." His words surprised me more than I expected. This was not an apology filled with dramatic emotion. It was something far more meaningful. It was an honest admission from a man who had spent most of his life believing he was right. "Dad," I said gently, "you always wanted what you believed was best for me." He sighed and looked down at his coffee cup. "Maybe, but somewhere along the way I confused my definition of success with yours." He looked back at me. "I kept measuring your business against companies that were never trying to accomplish the same thing." My mother smiled quietly, but allowed him to continue. "I thought because your company was smaller, your dream was smaller. I never stopped to consider that maybe you were building something completely different." Hearing those words lifted a weight I had carried for years without fully realizing it. I had imagined this conversation many times in my head, usually ending with me explaining every decision I had made since opening my workshop. Instead, none of that seemed necessary. "I never wanted to prove you wrong," I said. "I only wanted the chance to prove myself right." My father nodded slowly. "I understand that now." He disappeared into the living room for a moment before returning with a small cardboard box. He placed it gently on the table in front of me. "I found this while cleaning the attic last weekend." Inside the box were several notebooks from my childhood. One contained drawings of furniture designs I had made when I was 10 years old. Another held pages filled with sketches of wallets, briefcases, journals, and handmade boxes that I had imagined building one day. Tucked inside the final notebook was a folded sheet of paper written in my own uneven handwriting. At the top I had written, "One day I want to build things people will keep forever." I stared at the page for several moments before smiling. I had completely forgotten writing those words. My father looked at the notebook before speaking softly. "I think you knew who you wanted to become much earlier than I realized." We both laughed quietly. Apparently I did. He leaned back in his chair. "When you were young, I believed my job was to protect you from disappointment. Somewhere along the way, I became the person creating it instead." I reached across the table and rested my hand on his arm. "You are here now. That matters more." My mother quietly wiped away a tear before smiling at both of us. The conversation lasted another hour, but it no longer felt like we were discussing business. We were discussing understanding, respect, and the realization that families sometimes spend years talking without truly listening. Before I left, my father walked me to my truck just as he had done after countless family dinners before. The evening air felt cool, carrying the familiar scent of freshly mowed grass through the neighborhood. He placed his hand on my shoulder and smiled. The next time someone asks what my son does for a living, he said, "I am not going to tell them you own a small business." I raised an eyebrow playfully. "No." He shook his head. "I'm going to tell them my son built a company people trust." I finally understand that those are not the same thing. As I drove home, I realized nothing about my workshop had changed. It was still the same modest building with the same 6 employees, the same carefully crafted journals, and the same commitment to doing ordinary work extraordinarily well. The difference was that the people closest to me had finally begun seeing it through the same lens that my customers always had. Sometimes success changes a business. Sometimes it changes a family. And sometimes the greatest victory is not hearing strangers recognize your value. It is hearing the people who raised you finally believe in the person you quietly became. Several years passed, and although many things around me changed, the values that had guided my business from the very beginning remained exactly the same. Carter Leather Works expanded into a larger workshop on the edge of Columbus, but we never became the kind of company that measured success by how many locations we could open or how quickly we could increase production. Instead, we invested in better equipment, trained skilled craftspeople, and continued making products that customers expected to use for decades rather than replace after a season. Our team grew from 6 employees to nearly 30, yet every new person who joined us heard the same message on the first day. We were not simply manufacturing journals. We were earning trust one customer at a time. Charles Bennett remained a trusted friend over the years. We spoke several times each year, sometimes about business, but more often about leadership, responsibility, and the importance of protecting values that could easily disappear when companies became too focused on rapid growth. Every time we met, he reminded me that recognition had never been the destination. It was only evidence that consistent effort eventually became visible. His advice kept me grounded whenever new opportunities appeared. Several investment groups approached me with generous offers to purchase the company. Each proposal promised faster expansion, larger facilities, and greater profits. I thanked them sincerely before declining every offer. I had not spent years building a company centered on relationships only to surrender those relationships for a larger number on a balance sheet. Some people thought I lacked ambition. I simply believed ambition could be measured in different ways. My greatest ambition was to create something that would still deserve the trust of customers 20 years from now. Family dinners changed in quiet but meaningful ways. My father no longer introduced me as the son with the little notebook business. Instead, whenever neighbors or relatives asked about my work, he smiled with unmistakable pride. "My son owns a company that believes quality still matters," he would say. Sometimes he even carried one of our journals with him, showing people the stitching and leather while explaining how each one was carefully made by hand. Every time I watched him do that, I remembered the evenings when he had questioned every decision I made. Those memories no longer carried disappointment. They reminded me how much people could grow when they were willing to reconsider what success truly meant. My mother often laughed and teased him by saying he had become my unofficial salesman. He would simply smile and admit she was probably right. Emma changed as well. One afternoon, she visited the workshop with her children. They watched our craftspeople cut leather, stitch covers, and emboss initials into finished journals. My nephew, now several years older, looked around with genuine excitement. "Uncle Noah," he asked, "did you really build all of this?" I smiled. "Not by myself. A lot of good people helped." He nodded thoughtfully before saying something that made everyone in the room smile. "I think I want to build something one day too." My father quietly looked at me from across the workshop without saying a word, but I could see the pride in his eyes. After the children left, he walked beside me through the production floor. "When you were younger," he admitted, "I believed the safest path was always the smartest path. Now I realize that sometimes the smartest path is simply staying faithful to work you believe in." I thanked him, and for the first time in my life there was nothing left that needed to be proven between us. We simply enjoyed each other's company. Every year I returned to the Bennett Leadership Forum, sometimes as a speaker and sometimes simply as a guest. During one session, a young entrepreneur stood up and asked me a question that immediately brought me back to those difficult family dinners years earlier. "How do you keep believing in your business when the people closest to you do not believe in it?" The room became completely quiet, as everyone waited for my answer. I smiled, because I knew that feeling well. The people around you can offer advice, I said. Sometimes that advice is wise. Sometimes it comes from fear rather than understanding. Listen respectfully, but never allow someone else's limited picture of your future to become your own. If your work serves people honestly, continue improving it. Time has a remarkable way of revealing what arguments never can. The audience applauded politely, but I hoped they remembered the idea more than the applause itself. After the session ended, I found Charles Bennett waiting near the stage with the same familiar smile he had worn the first day we met. "You have become exactly the leader I hoped you would become," he said. I laughed softly. I still feel like the same man who drove to Chicago wondering why anyone wanted to meet him. Charles nodded. "That is precisely why you have earned the respect you have today." As I drove home that evening, I thought about the notebook my father had found in the attic years earlier. The page where I had written that I wanted to build something people would keep forever still rested inside my office desk. Looking back, I realized I had misunderstood that dream when I was younger. I thought I wanted to build products that lasted a lifetime. What I had really built was something much greater. I had built trust that lasted, friendships that endured, a family that learned to understand one another, and a life that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. If there was one lesson my journey had taught me, it was that the world will always have people who judge your dream before they understand it. Some will measure your worth by the size of your company, your paycheck, or your public recognition. But the people who matter most will eventually recognize something far more valuable if you remain patient enough to let your character speak before your success does. In the end, the greatest achievement was never standing beside a billionaire on a stage or hearing strangers applaud my work. It was discovering that quiet integrity, practiced faithfully every ordinary day, could transform not only a business, but also the hearts of the people I loved most.